When I posted my first YouTube video just over a year ago, I never imagined I'd be here in the court press box, sitting 20 feet away from Alex Murdaugh. But here we are. Alex Murdaugh has officially been charged with the murder of his wife and son. He's lost his business, his property, his family, and now potentially his freedom. This case continues to receive national attention, and the state has to know that their every move will be scrutinized.
Okay, I don't play fast and loose with Discovery. That's how I play the game, and they both know this.
With this in mind, it's hard to imagine that they have anything less than an airtight case against Alex Murdaugh. But like we've seen in this story many times before, not everything is always as it seems.
The only reasons why those
Your Honor, I'm not done. If I could be heard without being interrupted and hijacked by the state.
Before we dive into this episode, I want to kind of explain how I'm doing this series. I mentioned the murders of Paul and Maggie in the first episode of the series and how multiple mysterious deaths have surrounded this family that could have played a factor in those murders. In episode 1 and 2, we covered the boating accident and the death of Mallory Beach. In episode 3 and 4, we covered the death of Stephen Smith. In episode 5, we covered the murder of Paul and Maggie as it could relate to the boating accident or death of Stephen Smith. In episode 6, we covered the death of Gloria Satterfield and Alex's financial crimes. In episode 7, we covered Alec and drugs. And now, here in episode 8, we're going to again cover the murders of Paul and Maggie, but as they could relate to Alex's financial crimes or drug use. But there's one more thing I want to dive into first. Living in the area while covering this story has been an interesting experience for me. I've spoken with a few people that knew Alec and noticed a trend. They all mentioned gambling. Now, none of them flat out said, I think Alec owed a gambling debt that he couldn't pay, and that's why Maggie and Paul were killed. They just seemed to have an awareness that gambling was an issue and a suspicion that it could be a factor in these murders. Let's dive in and see if there's more to this gambling theory. The first thing I thought about when considering the Murdaughs and gambling was Alex Murdaugh's great-grandfather, Randolph Murdaugh Sr. Randolph Murdaugh Sr. was the 14th Circuit Solicitor for South Carolina and served from 1920 to 1940. He didn't resign from his position, but was killed while holding it. On July 19, 1940, he was in his car crossing railroad tracks on his way home when his car was struck by a train and he was killed. There was some mystery surrounding the event as his car was just parked on the tracks when it was hit, and we don't know why he didn't simply get out of the car. What made me think of this incident for this section is that it was reported that he was coming home late at night from a poker game. I wanted to keep digging to see if there were any other connections from the Murdaughs to gambling. I found this article here on gambling games in South Carolina. At one point in time, there was over 37,000 video poker games in South Carolina, but the article explains that, quote, a South Carolina Supreme Court ruling outlawed video poker after the largely unregulated industry introduced gambling casinos and bare-knuckle politics that raised enough money to help topple Governor David Beasley. But video poker died a slow death as every loophole or politician was exploited until there were no avenues left. If winning or losing a game was based on skill, it was considered legal, but if it was based on chance, it was outlawed. The way the games were designed, this left a gray area that could be exploited, and a game's legality would often be argued in court. So do we have any evidence that a Murdaugh was involved in any of these video gambling shenanigans? Let's take another look at that article from the State, published in 2003. It details how an anonymous tip was called into the sheriff's office as a few video gambling machines were being unloaded into a store in Allendale. The sheriff immediately came and confiscated them, bringing them to the judge in the area to rule them either legal or illegal. The article says, quote, Sheriff Carter immediately took the machines to Allendale County Magistrate Carl Love for ruling. Carter said the video company seemed ready for the case. Within 15 minutes, the judge would rule the game legal. Both the sheriff and the judge would later claim that neither of them knew much about the laws. The article continues, quote, neither SLED nor the Attorney General's office knew what happened. If notified, they could have offered expert testimony that Chess Challenge 2 is illegal. The next step would be for the prosecutor or solicitor to appeal the judge's ruling in court. This is where Randolph Murdaugh III comes in, and things continue to get weird. Murdaugh did appeal Judge Love's decision to make Chess Challenge 2 legal, but it seemed to be just for show. His appeal was taken to State Judge Perry Buckner, quote, but Murdaugh did not introduce evidence against the machine in court, records show. Murdaugh said in an interview he did not realize until the last minute how weak his case was, though he had a month to prepare it. The prosecutor, Murdaugh, asked Buckner to reject his appeal, citing, among other things, that he had talked to, quote, someone in whom I have great confidence and faith, end quote. and that person told him the machines were legal, according to court transcript. Murdaugh did not identify that person to the court and would not name the person for the state. Buckner ruled Chess Challenge 2 legal. Murdaugh, chief prosecutor for 17 years in the state's 5 southernmost counties, said he has since tried to overturn Allendale Magistrate Love and believes Chess Challenge 2 is illegal. There's a lot of back and forth here, and it seems to me that Murdaugh wanted his public stance to be against these gambling games, but wanted no part in working against them, and in some instances, even helped keep them legal. I'm going to be honest, this whole story seemed to reek of corruption. Let's say you were a gambling machine owner, wanted to ensure your games would be legal, and had connections with local authorities in the area. How would you do it? Well, a tip being conveniently called in the moment your machines are being unloaded, so the sheriff can immediately take the case to the judge, and the judge can immediately rule them legal before any of the state's higher agencies have an opportunity to fight against you, seems like the perfect way to do it. And when the local prosecutor or solicitor is pressured to appeal this hasty ruling, just make sure that he's in your pocket too. Is this what actually happened? I don't know. But I did find precedents for corruption in the Lowcountry when it came to video poker. In 1984, the largest video game poker owner in the Lowcountry, Henry Ingram, was the focus of an FBI sting operation set up to incriminate Ingram and the Jasper County Sheriff at the time. It was set up to expose bribes Ingram gave to the sheriff to allow illegal drinking and gambling in one of Ingram's nightclubs. Ingram and the sheriff were found guilty, and Ingram served 10 months in federal prison. Fun side note, Ingram's attorney for this case was Jim Moss of the Moss, Coonan, Fleming firm that Corey Fleming was a part of. So we have evidence that the Murdaugh family might have a history of being involved in illegal gambling, and I've had a number of interactions with people who knew Alec who mentioned gambling. But what actual evidence do we have of Alec being involved with gambling? Mandy Matney with the Murdaugh Murders podcast filed a Freedom of Information Act request for Alex Murdaugh's phone calls in jail, and one in particular stuck out to me when thinking about this section.
Hey, I hit 9 out of 11 games on Sunday on the pro games. Well, I missed the Eagles and I missed the Steelers. The Eagles were 3.5-point favorites over the Giants, and they lost. And the Steelers were 4.5-point underdogs to the Bengals, and they lost by 20. But I hit 9 out of 11. That's pretty damn hard.
Yeah.
I won like 6 soups, 4 beef sticks, a bunch of crackers, cookies, a bunch of canteen shit.
Well, that's good.
There was like 13 of us playing. Everybody put in something,
Right.
I won 13 things. So anyway, how you doing?
Now, you might think it's a stretch that saying because Alec was gambling a few dollars in beef sticks in jail, that he was part of some underground, high-stakes gambling ring. And you'd be right to think that. But what this does show is the potential for Alec to be a gambling addict, someone who is compelled to gamble, whether it's a few beef sticks or a few $100,000 you stole from a client. While doing my research, one thing I noticed is drugs, bootlegging, and gambling always seem to pop up together. This story seems to be no exception. On August 11th, 2022, a bond revocation hearing was held for Curtis Eddie Smith, the man who allegedly aided Alex Murdaugh in his roadside shooting fiasco. He was caught violating his bond terms and sent to jail until his trial. Immediately following Smith's hearing, there was a bond hearing for a man named Spencer Roberts. Cretin Waters, the state prosecutor for most of Alex Murdaugh's charges, explained that Roberts was arrested while a search warrant was being executed. He went on to say that the search warrant uncovered a gambling den, a gun, and drugs. Unfortunately, at the moment, we don't have much information about this, quote, gambling den, but according to Cretin Waters, Roberts allegedly received money from Alex Murdaugh through Curtis Eddie Smith. So what does all of this tell us? It doesn't prove anything, but it sets the stage for the potential that Alec was caught up in some shady gambling rings. It also potentially explains where all of the money went. Alec stole millions, but at the moment is allegedly broke. If Alec is a compulsive gambler, this could explain where much of that money went. It could also potentially explain how he got started stealing from clients in the first place. Oftentimes, people that do really bad things ease into them. They don't just start immediately doing the worst of it. Gambling addicts often think to themselves, this next bet is going to be the big one that I win that can dig me out of this hole of debt I'm in. I could see the birthplace of Alec's financial crime spree being with intentions to pay these people back, thinking I'm going to borrow this money from this client's settlement without them knowing, and I'll pay the account back when I win this next big bet. But when that money is lost, he has to try again, this time with the next client's money. Eventually, he's dug himself so deep in a hole that he's not concerned with paying clients back anymore. One last interesting thing to note in this section, the biggest attorney for video poker companies in South Carolina back in the day was none other than Alex's current attorney, Dick Harpootlian. Since the murders of Paul and Maggie occurred on June 7, 2021, almost no information has officially been made public, but many details have been reported on. It's hard to figure out how to include some of these things, as many of these reports are unverified or contradict each other, but I'll do my best to go over what I can. Take everything in this section with a grain of salt, as we don't know how accurate some of these things actually are. Now that Alec has been indicted, it seems as if most people have made up their minds about who killed Maggie and Paul, and I'll talk about my opinion on that later, but I really want to remain open to all of the possibilities at the moment. As I go over some of what we know about the murders, I'll weave in my thoughts on how his financial crimes and potential link to drugs and gambling could be a factor. Let's dive in. The day of the murders, Alex's brother, John Marvin Murdaugh, takes his father, Randolph Murdaugh III, to the hospital from their home in Varnville. Varnville is a small town that butts up right next to Hampton, and their home is off the main road next to the tracks that run through both towns. We don't have an official report of what Alex's alibi is, but reports claim that he was gone for about an hour when he left Moselle to go visit his mother at the Varnville house, located about 20 minutes away. When he returned, he found his wife and son murdered. You could look at this a couple ways. My first thought was, how convenient that you happen to be gone for the 1 hour that the murders took place. But then I thought if someone was after Maggie and Paul, maybe they waited until Alec left to commit the crime, so they wouldn't have to deal with other people there. Back in April of 2022, Fitz News detailed leaked info that blood spatter was found on Alec's clothes, which would obviously put him at the crime scene the night of the murder and prove his alibi false. In addition, it's been reported that cell data and geofencing may be used in this case to show Alec was at Moselle at the time of the crime. Does blood spatter evidence or cell data mean that Alec committed the crime? Not in my opinion. I've always been really open to the idea that Alec was there, but because of the situation, he still needed to lie about it. For example, let's say Maggie and Paul were killed because Alec was caught up in criminal activity. Alec explaining who killed Maggie and Paul would further incriminate him for his involvement with drugs and gambling. The biggest hole I see in this theory, though, is that nobody seems too concerned for Buster's safety. If Paul and Maggie were killed because of Alec's ties to crime rings, wouldn't Buster be in danger now, too? We know 2 different guns were used to kill Paul and Maggie, and there's a few things to unpack here. Paul was killed with a shotgun. They can determine this pretty easily because a shotgun round is easy to identify, as it shoots a group of pellets as opposed to a single bullet. The gun used to kill Maggie is a little less clear. The round used was .300 Blackout. .300 Blackout is most commonly used in AR-15 style rifles, which are very common here in the South. Like most handguns, AR-15s are semi-automatic, meaning each time you pull the trigger, 1 round will come out. But no actions are needed to be ready to fire the next round. If you Google .300 Blackout and look at the images, you pretty much only see AR-15 style rifles, but they are not the only style of rifle that uses that round. There are bolt-action rifles chambered in .300 Blackout. These are rifles you'll typically see for deer hunting, for example. This style seems less likely, as they're not semi-automatic. When you fire a round, you have to unlock the bolt and move it to the rear to eject the casing, then push it back into place to chamber the next round before firing each shot. But it is possible that a .300 Blackout bolt-action rifle was used. Setting the style of firearms aside for a moment, what else do we need to consider when looking at the fact that 2 guns were used? Well, I think it means one of 3 things. 1, there may have been 2 people there to kill Paul and Maggie, so 4 people total involved in the situation. 2, the killer brought 2 guns and used one for each person, potentially in an attempt to throw off the investigation. Or 3, one of the victims had a gun, and after being shot with the killer's gun, the killer used the victim's gun to kill the other victim. One thing to note when looking at these possibilities is if a lone killer did bring 2 guns to throw off the police and kill each person with a different gun, that means that they planned on killing both Paul and Maggie, and one of them wasn't just in the wrong place at the right time. They were both intended targets. On episode 56 of the Murdaugh Family Murders Impact of Influence podcast, Seton Tucker explains that she had a phone conversation with John Marvin Murdaugh, who described June 7th this way. Paul was splitting his time between staying at Moselle in Hampton and John Marvin's house in Oakety, as he was working for his uncle John Marvin, who owns an equipment rental company in both locations, one in Hampton and one in Oakety. Paul had worked at the Oakety store that day, but was driving to Hampton that night to have dinner with his family. After Alec called 911, he called his brother, John Marvin, who says he came from Oakety to Moselle. When he arrived, he observed that law enforcement created a perimeter of about 50 to 75 yards around where he saw what he presumed to be two bodies covered with sheets. The next morning, John Marvin drove back out to Moselle and finds out Maggie's phone was missing. He told law enforcement that Buster had a way to track Maggie's phone, and he helps them locate it. They drive down the road, get in the general area, and find the phone in about 15 minutes. According to John Marvin, a SLED officer is the one that found the phone, and John Marvin never touched it. When it was located, they secured the scene. John Marvin then called Alec to get the passcode for the police. It's rumored that Paul's phone was found near or under his body. In a few different articles, People magazine claimed that sources told them Alec and Maggie's relationship was going through a rough spot, that they were separated and Maggie was staying at their beach house in Edisto, about an hour from Moselle. Sources told them Alec lured Maggie to the property the night of the murders, and that Maggie even texted a friend saying her husband's behavior felt fishy. Was this a case of two people simply not getting along anymore, or did she find out about the financial crimes, and was she leaving him because of that? Did she threaten to expose him? Others close to the family claimed that they had a great relationship, that they were not separated, and Alec's brother John Marvin said it was his understanding that Maggie was still living at Moselle, not the Edisto house. In another leak, it was reported that only moments before the murders, Paul had taken a video on his cell phone of his mother and father. Initially, it was speculated that Alec and Maggie were arguing in that video, and that's why Paul took it. Like he knew something bad was about to happen. But later on, a source familiar with the video said, quote, "There is talking and it's extremely playful and friendly. It sounds perfectly normal, like any happy family, mother, father, and child, doing something together. They are spread out, it sounds like, and they just are talking back and forth." At the time of the murders, Randolph Murdaugh III, Alex Murdaugh, and Buster Murdaugh were facing a civil suit filed by Renee Beach, the mother of Mallory Beach. This suit alleged that Buster allowed Paul to use his ID to buy alcohol before the crash. There was a hearing scheduled for June 10, 2021, just 3 days after the murder of Paul and Maggie. It's important to remember that at the time of the murders, none of Alec's financial crimes had yet come to light. Was Alec worried that as a result of this lawsuit, his financial crimes would be uncovered? Some speculate that by killing Paul, maybe he thought he could prevent this suit from moving forward. The timing does seem almost too close to be a coincidence, but killing Paul and Maggie would only put your whole life under a microscope. In addition, Paul being out of the picture doesn't change whether Renee Beach has grounds to sue Alec. I can't make the motive make sense here, but there could be missing pieces to the story that do change things. I also think it's important to remember that sometimes desperate people do things that just don't make sense. So how could these murders be related to drugs or gambling? If Alec accrued a debt that he couldn't pay, compulsively spending money on drugs or gambling, could someone have come to the property to collect or send a message? I mentioned at the end of episode 7 that Alec had written a series of checks to Eddie Smith. Alec allegedly used Eddie Smith as a courier to pay for drugs and, I would speculate, potentially gambling bets as well. The last and final check was the largest amount, written for $22,109. And it was written just 10 days before the murders of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh. You can read into this a few ways. One, was this check significantly larger than the previous ones because it included a payment for a hired hit? Or two, was this check significantly larger because he was paying off a debt to a drug or gambling boss? Maybe someone said to Alec, "Pay me X amount of your debt before June 1st, or there will be consequences." Maybe Alec wrote the biggest check he could, but it wasn't enough, and his wife and son lost their lives because of it. I mentioned earlier the idea that if Alec was there, that doesn't mean that he necessarily killed Paul and Maggie. But the inverse of that is true as well. Just because he wasn't there doesn't mean he couldn't have hired someone to do the job for him. So now that we've covered the events that unfolded to bring us to Alex Murdaugh sitting in a courtroom charged with murder, what is actually going on right now and what's coming? First, let's set the stage. Alec is represented by a few attorneys, but his head attorney is Dick Harpootlian. Harpootlian has been an attorney in South Carolina longer than I've been alive and is known as one of the state's top attorneys. His career has been riddled with big cases and some controversies, and as this case unfolds, we're bound to see some interesting theatrics from him.
And to just ignore that, I think does a disservice to this court and the criminal justice system.
The only reason why those
Your Honor,
deadlines
I'm
were
not
reached-
done. If I could be heard without being interrupted and
You interrupted me, Mr.
hijacked by the state as they continue to try to hide the ball on this case.
He is also currently a state senator. Opposite Alec and Dick, we have the prosecution, being headed up by Chief Attorney Cretin Waters, who has years of experience under his belt as well, as he has worked in the South Carolina Office of Attorney General since 1998. He's typically not known for theater in the courtroom, but seeing as this is the biggest case in South Carolina in recent history, he's shown himself to be willing to match Dick's energy in the courtroom. Presiding over the case, we have the Honorable Judge Clifton Newman. Judge Newman was an attorney from 1976 till 2000 and has been a judge since then. Luckily for us, he's known for being pretty open and transparent with these cases, so hopefully I'll be sitting in the courtroom as media for the trial. Now that we've set the stage, I'm going to explain generally where we are now. If you have a law degree, you might notice I'm sacrificing a touch of accuracy in order to explain things as simply and briefly as possible. Alec was indicted and charged with the murders of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh on July 14, 2022. Harpootlian immediately invoked the right to a speedy trial and requested discovery. Discovery is the prosecution handing over their evidence to the defense so that the defense can prepare for the trial. Evidence must be handed over within 30 days of the request. In America, you also have the right to a speedy trial, as it would be unjust to arrest and charge someone for a crime and then keep them in prison for years before the case ever goes to trial. 34 days after Alec was indicted for the murders, Dick Harpootlian held a press conference where he claimed that the prosecution last minute requested a protective order over the evidence.
On last Friday, almost at 5 o'clock, we get an email from the prosecutor telling us he wants some sort of order that would seal everything, basically, which we believe is inconsistent with Judge Newman's denial of the gag order. We tried to tweak it a little bit and finally just said no.
A protective order provides instruction on how to provide and handle the evidence.
You went to a grand jury and said you've got enough evidence to convict Alex Murdaugh, convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Where is it? I don't have a shred of paper. I don't have an email. I don't have an exhibit. I don't have any evidence.
Harpootlian went on to explain he was filing a motion to compel and requesting a hearing be held in order to force the prosecution to hand over the evidence.
And you would assume they would have made it available a month ago so we could evaluate the quality and quantity of it and begin to hire experts, interview witnesses, and examine any physical items they will try to introduce into evidence.
12 days later, that hearing was held. But the prosecution made it sound like the defense had no issue with the protective order until the last minute, insinuating the defense are the ones playing the games.
And again, defense counsel was completely on board with this up until after 5 p.m. on Friday before the discovery was due on Monday. And they changed their mind. And I feel before I'm the one to authorize and press a button and disseminate this information that has such value to at least out of abundance of caution say, Your Honor, if not this case, what case is a protective order warranted?
Waters wants to hand over all the evidence, but wants to limit who's allowed to see the evidence to those who are authorized by the court.
And again, my concern is not Dick Harpootlian, it's not Jim Griffin. I've worked with both of these people and they both said the same thing about me. But inevitably, when it's not authorized, it's not directed, inevitably though, this information could end up down the line as the case is prepared in the hands of people whose motives aren't as pure. And all of this is done is to protect that because this information literally is probably worth over $1 million to an unscrupulous hands. And I think we have to protect it for that reason. I say again, Your Honor, if not this case, what case would a protective order be appropriate?
The judge ruled with the prosecution and granted a temporary protective order before ordering the prosecution to go ahead and turn over the discovery to the defense. The day after the hearing, Michael DeWitt with the Hampton Guardian reported that SLED, along with a dive team, metal detectors, and boats, were searching a swampy area near Hampton. I got a text from David Moses with the Murdaugh Murders podcast about it and immediately grabbed all of my gear and rushed out the door. David sent me to a pin, and when I arrived just under an hour later, nobody was there. He wasn't super confident that he sent me the right location, so for the next 30 minutes or so, I was rushing around the area with David on the phone and Mandy in the background, trying to figure out where this search team was. Okay, so I just shared my location with you, and it should be good for the next hour. You should just be able to see wherever I'm at. Long story short, David was right the first time, and I had just completely missed them. I did pass the dive team on my way out, but didn't realize at the time it was them. The area that they were searching in is about 2 miles south of the Varnville home that Alec allegedly claims he was at during the murders. SLED would not comment on what the search was for, but it's pretty easy to assume that they were probably looking for a gun. While making this episode, and as the events have been unfolding the past few months with Alex Murdaugh and his indictment, I realized that in my gut, I didn't believe that he did it. I wanted to analyze that because that is a bias, and I was curious as to why I had that feeling. I'm not someone that believes in always following your gut. Oftentimes, your gut feeling is plain wrong. If you need proof, just think about how many people have opposing gut feelings, and they can't both be right. I believe in most situations, the wisest move is to push your gut feelings aside. Look at the situation, the tangible evidence, the circumstances, and form an opinion based off of the information you have. While I don't know who murdered Paul and Maggie, when I set my gut feeling aside, I do find myself more open to the possibility it was Alec. I took some time to reflect on why initially my gut didn't believe Alec killed Paul and Maggie. I realized it's because I don't want to believe it's possible that a husband and a father could murder his wife and son. Somehow in my mind, it's just less tragic if a gang member did it, or if it was a revenge killing of some sort. It feels too hard to stomach the idea that the man who's supposed to cherish and love his wife, protect and raise his son, potentially betrayed both of them and ended their lives. Sitting with that thought is tough. I don't know how all of this will unfold, but trust me when I say there is more out there. On Sunday, July 17th, I drove out to Hampton to gather with Stephen Smith's family, loved ones, and supporters to unveil his new headstone.
2, 1.
It was a roller coaster of emotions for all in attendance, including myself. I got to spend time with some other friends telling the story, as well as Stephen's mother, Sandy. There was plenty of laughing, crying, and renewing hope for justice.
After all these years, Sandy has taught me to always hold on to hope and love, even when that's all you have.
I didn't know Stephen Smith, but I knew Stephen Smith. His passion for healthcare, his desire to be a nurse and then one day a doctor. Imagine what kind of doctor he would have been.
Lots of you in my audience gave money to contribute to this headstone, and I just want to pass along to you how much it meant to Sandy and Stephen's family. You've played a part in making this story brighter, and you should be proud of that. While this story has had many twists and turns, it's still far from over, and I, among with many others, left feeling a sense of hope that Stephen's story will end with justice. When it was announced that Alex Murdaugh was indicted for the murders, I decided I wanted to start going to some of the hearings and the trial as press, if possible. I'm partnering with Mandy, Liz, and David of the Murdaugh Murders podcast. I'll be getting footage for future episodes, as well as live streaming many of the events to the Murdaugh Murders podcast YouTube page. So be on the lookout for those. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be honored if you subscribed. Since starting this Murdaugh series, I've branched out and started covering other cases. If you're following the Murdaugh saga and want to see another case in the area with a few of the same players, I'd recommend watching my video on a wealthy couple on Hilton Head Island who disappeared without a trace. The story is full of mystery, twists, and turns, and I know you'd find it fascinating. You can watch it here or YouTube's recommended video here. Love you guys. See y'all in the next one.